So hello, it's my first time working with ESPON, so quite exciting, but I do feel a bit of a fraud sitting in the comfy chair on stage. So I'm the lead coordinator for the UK on the urban rural connectivity in non-metropolitan regions, or URRUC, as we've nominally called it. I apologise for the acronym, it's totally my fault, it's absolutely terrible. There we go, wrong button. So I'm going to briefly talk it today and just summarise what we're doing in the project. So it started in June of 2018, so it's about 6 months into the project at this point in time. It was motivated by the stakeholders' needs to improve transport connectivity and accessibility, in remote and comparatively underdeveloped non-metropolitan regions. And the rationale behind that is that new regional economics is largely built around reductions in transport costs. And the decline in costs over the last century in particular has been central to economic growth and success, allowing regions and territories to embed more firmly in regional, national and global economies, offering access in particular to key services and opportunities for employment. So by improving accessibility and connectivity in these areas, what we're aiming then to do is reduce deficiencies in comparatively underdeveloped locations, in particular in terms of urban-rural connectivity. So what are the aims and objectives of the project? Well, to contribute to improving transport policy and transport systems related to urban-rural connectivity in 4 non-metropolitan areas, which are, broadly, Scarborough Borough in the UK, where Coventry University have a campus, which is why we were requested to get involved in this particular project on behalf of the stakeholders. Marina Alta in Spain, Regione Ligure in Italy, or Valarasia more specifically within that region, and then Västerbotten County in Sweden. So all 4 are broadly coastal territories with common issues related to remoteness and accessibility, very similar transport flows from underpopulated rural areas into more concentrated populated centres, particularly along coastal areas, but again, not connected to large metropolitan centres, which would have given them greater opportunities for development. This project then will improve urban and rural mobility from these sort of underdeveloped rural areas into the more concentrated urban centres through knowledge transfer activities, so a range of activities based around understanding what the stakeholders' needs are, looking at the European literature and recommendations around that, and then making recommendations on improving transport infrastructure and integrated transport policies in these areas, and then further taking those recommendations and applying them to similar or comparable non-metropolitan areas across the EU. And again, as I say, the learnings will prove applicable then to other comparable non-metropolitan areas. So why urban-rural connectivity? So the metro regions are urban areas of more than 250,000 inhabitants, and the groupings that we're looking at here in the territories are actually below that level, are about NUTS 3, LAO 1. And what we're focusing on then is non-metropolitan regions, which are actually more definable by not being metropolitan regions than anything else. So they are areas of less than 250,000 in terms of classification, and not attached to these metropolitan areas. And what you largely find is that there are significant differences in development compared to metropolitan compared to non-metropolitan areas. Just to give you an example, when you look at, say, firm composition in these particular territories, they are notably different, largely based around supplying the needs of the locality or taking advantage of a resource in an area. You don't tend to see these larger traded companies operating. And so by improving transport accessibility and connectivity, you'd hope to improve these opportunities and improve access to these areas and encourage then a sort of movement of goods and services away from metropolitan into these non-metropolitan areas. So these urban-rural interactions represent a range of increasingly interconnected community types, and it's the urban-rural as component of it that is specific to this project. And what we're seeing then in the literature itself is a growing emphasis on developing these linkages, and there's a whole range of literature, not least of which is the Europe 2020 strategy. So the lens through which we're examining these urban-rural linkages are economic, spatial and governance, and each of the partners involved have specific skill sets, as I'll come on to in a moment, that help us understand these sort of drivers that help develop these urban-rural areas. And I did want to sort of make one point here as we look at the urban areas and the interaction with rural areas. There's a tendency to think of movement from rural to urban to take advantage of services and take advantage of employment opportunities. But increasingly what we're seeing is a degree of counter-urbanization, a movement from urban areas into rural areas to take advantage of leisure activities, what's perceived as improved living lifestyles, a sort of a green economy as well, is beginning to increasingly locate in rural areas. And we want to improve and encourage these kind of back and forward movement of goods and services. So what methodology are we using? We were inspired by the PER project, I think it's 2013, the potential for rural regions. And they took broadly speaking, a top-down, bottom-up perspective. So we adopted that methodology and took a 4-step plan. So first of all, we're contextualizing rural-urban relations using the European literature and other academic literature. The next step then is the regional context, getting the stakeholders' perspective. So we've been identifying a range of stakeholders and engaging in discussions with them, structured interviews, workshops, and so forth to try and get their perspective. Very early sort of findings at this stage, but I'll mention them in a moment. Thereafter, we'll then assess the region's urban-rural transport needs, and we'll create 4 case studies tailored to each of the 4 regions, but we'll then take the comparable components from each of these studies and make recommendations accordingly. So what are the outputs? Well, I just put up the work packages here to explain how we've been developing the project so far. We've had about 6 months. Work packages 2.1 and 2.2 are now complete. I don't really have findings from these because 2.1 was about setting the frameworks for the project and 2.2 was about understanding urban-rural linkages in these particular areas. We're at stage 2.3 and we've had some very interesting discussions already with the stakeholders. One of the most common repeated findings that we've found is their sense of lack of priority, that they're not prioritized as a local authority in particular when it comes to the flow of funding from national to regional actors, as it were. So again, they increasingly emphasize the need to be taken seriously at a regional and national level in terms of what they're trying to develop for their infrastructure. And I think one of the strongest quotes we've had so far was from the lead stakeholder, which is Scarborough, who said, we have to try and move 7 million people annually in a sort of a tourist season with an infrastructure designed for 110,000 people. And I think that's quite a powerful message to try and bring back to different levels of authority. And again, it's something to consider at a federal level as well. The later stages of the project are going to be developed by different members of the team, and this is the team. So obviously we're being coordinated by ESPON. We are the lead coordinators, Coventry University. We are located, we have a campus in Scarborough, as I mentioned already, which is why we began to develop these relations with the stakeholders. And when they came to us and said, we have a particular project we'd like to pursue, we said, very keen to get involved. We're also involved with Nordregio in Sweden, who are our sort of mapping and GIS experts. Politecnico di Torino in Italy, who are supporting us in terms of governance and understanding how it impacts on the transport policies. And then finally, University of Valencia in Spain, who are going to give us that sort of overarching European perspective on the later stages of the project. So what's the timeline? So I brought the Gantt chart with us. We've delivered the inception report and the interim report at this stage. We've had 2 meetings. I would just like to say that the best laid plans of men and mice does not survive contact with the enemy. We've already changed the meeting venue for the 3rd meeting, which is no longer in Västerbotten. It's now Marina Alta, Spain. We switched the 2 around because nobody wanted to go to Sweden in January because everyone's afraid of the snow. Yeah, that's the kind of transport problems we have to deal with. So that's just a short summary of the project. So thank you for your attention.